Have you ever wondered what pure, unfiltered evil looks like when it's born, not made? Not in the city, not in the noise of civilization, but deep in the silent folds of the Missouri Ozarks, where the woods whisper your name before you even step inside. Locals still talk about them, two brothers who lived like animals, hunted like predators, and treated every stranger as prey. They say the brothers didn't just live in the mountains, they belonged to them, wild, feral, and untouched by human conscience. When women started disappearing from nearby towns in the early 1900s, search parties blamed bears, wolves, or bandits. But the truth was far more monstrous. Because what those men found, hidden in the brothers' rotting cabin, wasn't the work of beasts. It was the work of men who'd become something worse. Tonight, we're going back to that cabin, to the place the forest tried to hide. And once you hear what was inside, you'll never trust the silence of the woods again. Welcome to Forgotten Remains. It began with the fog. A dense, heavy veil rolled down from the Ozark ridges, swallowing the trail and the horse team in a pale blur. The stagecoach driver, Elias Kern, cracked his reins and muttered under his breath, listening to the wheels creak over mud-soaked ruts. His passengers, 3 souls bound for the mining camps of Miller's Hollow, sat silent, wrapped in coats, breathing the same damp air that smelled of pine and rust. They were only 12 miles from town when the fog thickened into something else, something that muffled even the sound of the horses. Elias could no longer see the lamps swinging on the coach, only the faint outline of the trees, twisted and leafless though it was spring. He slowed the team. Easy now, easy. From the forest came a sound, a sharp whistle, then a low, gurgling growl that didn't belong to any coyote. The horses froze. Elias lifted his shotgun from the side rail and stepped down, boots sinking into the wet clay. Anyone out there? His voice vanished into the fog. No answer, just the crack of a branch and the faint clatter of stones rolling down the slope. When he turned back, one of the horses was gone. The harness hung limp, cut clean through. Inside the coach, the woman in the corner. Mrs. Leary whispered, "We should keep moving." But before Elias could climb back up, he saw movement on the ridge above them. 3 shapes, broad-shouldered and barefoot, their skin the color of dirt, watching without a sound. The shapes moved downhill in perfect silence. By the time the coach rolled into Miller's Hollow at dawn, it was missing 1 horse, 1 trunk, and 1 passenger. Mrs. Leary sat catatonic beside the window, her face scratched and bleeding. When the sheriff asked what had happened, she said only 5 words. They moved like animals, but weren't. The Miller County Gazette, dated March 7, 1901, recorded the incident as an unfortunate attack by panthers. But those who lived in the valley knew better. For months, hunters had spoken of a family that lived without fire, deep in the woods past Burnt Creek Gap. Locals called them the Feral Brothers. No one remembered their real name. Their parents had come from Tennessee 40 years earlier and vanished not long after the war. The brothers were raised by the hills themselves. Hunters said they drank from the river and slept in hollow trees, their language a mix of growls and mutters. Farmers whispered that they came down only when the moon was black, trading animal pelts for salt and knives, always staring, never speaking. A few said they'd seen scars across their backs like ritual brands. But until that March morning, no one believed they'd ever touched a human being. 2 days later, Sheriff Harlan Dove assembled a posse, 5 men, each armed with lanterns and Winchester rifles. They followed the broken stage trail to where the attack had happened. The earth was clawed, the coach wheels sunk deep in mud. They found the missing horse a mile off, throat torn open, tongue missing. And near the creek bed, a single boot, half buried in the silt. Inside it was a human foot. The sheriff ordered the search extended through the timber. They found more than they expected. Remnants of snares made from barbed wire, strips of cloth nailed to trees, and a small clearing littered with bones polished smooth by weather. In the center, a circle of stones blackened by fire. And beside that fire pit, something that stopped them cold. A set of carved wooden figures, 3 tall, 1 smaller, all painted in what looked like dried blood. On the back of each, burned letters spelled 1 word, Mother. That night, Miller's Hollow locked its doors. The sheriff wrote a report that never reached the state archives because the telegraph office caught fire the same evening. Only 1 line from his handwritten notes survived, found years later in a rusted filing drawer. Whatever they are, they know the woods better than we know our own blood. Fog crept through the Ozarks again the following week. Travelers avoided the old mule trail. The sound of distant whistling echoed through the trees, always in threes, always at midnight. And in the mud along Burnt Creek, prints appeared. Bare feet the size of a man's, pressed deep into the earth, walking on all 4s. By the 2nd week of March, the fear in Miller's Hollow had spread like a sickness. Children weren't allowed near the woods. The church bell rang twice every night, once at dusk, once at dawn, to remind folks to stay inside. And still, the fog came back, thicker than before, rolling down the mountains like smoke from a hidden fire. Sheriff Harlan Dove sat alone in his office that morning, a map of the Ozarks laid flat on the table, pins marking where the disappearances had happened. 4 in total now. 2 travelers. 1 trapper. 1 local boy. The sheriff's deputy, Calvin Roach, a thin man with eyes too old for his face, stared at the map. "They're taking him closer each time," he said. "Yeah," Dove replied. "Like they're circling something." He didn't say what he really thought, that whatever those brothers were, they weren't hunting for food anymore. Outside, the posse was gathering. 6 men this time. Lanterns, rifles, hatchets. Each carried a small cross tied with twine and soaked in whiskey, a local superstition meant to keep spirits away. None of them laughed about it. They followed the creek north, deeper into the Ozark wilderness. By noon, they'd reached Burnt Creek Gap, where the air grew still, heavy with the smell of rot. Birds didn't sing here. Even the water ran quiet. Calvin stopped. "Sheriff," he whispered. "You see that? Up ahead, between the trees, something pale flickered. A tattered piece of cloth hanging from a branch. When they got closer, they saw it wasn't cloth. It was skin. Tanned. Human. Someone had carved a pattern into it, 3 circles joined by lines, like a family crest drawn by a madman. Beneath it, the ground was scattered with old bones and dried corn husks arranged in strange spirals. "Christ almighty," one of the men muttered, crossing himself. They pressed on. As the light faded, they found the trail. Bare footprints, deep in the mud, leading toward the base of a cliff that rose like a black wall against the dusk. A cave mouth yawned open halfway up, its entrance framed by tree roots and stacked stones. The sheriff motioned for silence. He raised his lantern. The smell hit them first, something sour, metallic, and old. Inside the cave walls, dozens of crude drawings covered the stone, stick figures, animals, shapes that looked like suns and eyes. But at the back, scratched in charcoal, was a single word written over and over again: home. Then came the sound, a slow, dragging breath from deeper inside. Something alive. The sheriff signaled 2 men forward. "Lanterns up," he whispered. They stepped deeper into the dark. The first thing the light touched was a pile of bones, hundreds of them, stacked neatly, each bleached clean. Next to it, a wooden crib, ancient and broken, with claw marks gouged into its sides. And then movement. From the far corner, a shadow uncoiled. The men froze. A shape crawled out into the lantern light. Broad shoulders, tangled hair, face streaked with mud and ash. Its eyes reflected yellow like an animal's. It was a man, or had once been. He looked straight at them, jaw slack, and made a sound between a growl and a sob. Calvin fired first. The echo slammed through the cave, sending bats shrieking from the ceiling. The figure collapsed, writhing, but as they approached, it was gone. Only blood smeared on the stone. Then came the laughter. From deeper inside the cave. Low, wet, and inhuman. The men backed toward the entrance, rifles shaking. The sheriff kept his eyes on the dark until the laughter stopped. Outside, night had fallen completely. The fog had returned, curling through the trees like white smoke. One of the men whispered, "Sheriff, where's Calvin?" No answer. They searched the clearing, calling his name. But all they found was his lantern, lying shattered near the creek, its flame flickering weakly against the wet earth. Next to it, half buried in the mud, was Calvin's badge, bent, streaked with blood, and beside it, a small carving of wood. 3 figures again. And this time, the smallest one was missing its head. The fog clung thick to the trees that morning when Deputy Hank Laramie led a small search party up the winding dirt path toward an area locals called Dead Man's Hollow. He'd been sheriff in these parts for over 2 decades, but the last few months had shaken him to his core. Too many disappearances. Too many whispered rumors about the Feral Brothers who lived deep in the woods. The missing included 2 schoolteachers, a traveling preacher, and even the town's own blacksmith's daughter. They'd vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the faint smell of smoke and decay drifting through the mountain air. "Keep your guns up," Hank warned as they approached a rotting fence line. No one's been this far since the war. Beyond the fence lay a cluster of animal bones: deer, raccoon, dogs, picked clean and arranged in twisted patterns, almost ceremonial. The group exchanged uneasy looks. One man muttered, "Looks like the devil himself eats here." They found the cabin half buried under vines and dead trees. It looked like it had grown out of the earth. A structure of warped boards, mud-chinked gaps, and a sagging tin roof. A thick stench wafted from inside, something between rot and old blood. Hank kicked open the door. The interior was worse than any nightmare. Skulls lined the mantel, each candlelit socket glowing faintly in the dark. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings of human faces, hundreds of them, overlapping, screaming, and staring. In one corner sat a crude wooden crib. Inside, a small animal carcass wrapped in torn lace. and near the far wall was a chain, heavy, rusted, bolted to the floor, with a shackle large enough for a man's ankle. The wood beneath it was scratched, clawed from desperate attempts to escape. Then someone spotted it. A journal, half-burned, sitting on the table. Hank picked it up with shaking hands. The handwriting was barely legible, scrawled in dirt and ash. "They come to us in the night. They say the hunger must be fed. Mama says the world forgot us, but the woods still remember our names." The sheriff's hands trembled. The others backed away when a soft sound echoed from the floorboards beneath them. A muffled knock, then another. Thump, thump. "Someone's under the cabin," Hank whispered. They tore up a section of the planks, and the smell that burst forth made them gag. Beneath, in a dark pit, lay bones piled high, tangled with scraps of clothing. And crouched at the very back, eyes glinting red from the torchlight, was a boy. Barefoot, filthy, his skin stretched tight over his skull. He hissed when the light hit him. Before anyone could react, he scrambled up from the pit and bolted into the woods with a sound that wasn't quite human, a screech that carried for miles. The men gave chase, but he vanished into the fog like a shadow returning home. That night, Hank couldn't sleep. He sat by his fire, staring at the journal, repeating the words, "The woods still remember our names." Outside, the wind picked up, moaning through the trees like a voice whispering back, "And now we remember yours too." By the time the next morning's light broke through the fog, Dead Man's Hollow was crawling with deputies and terrified locals. But no one dared step too close to that cabin again. Only Sheriff Hank Laramie and the town coroner went inside to collect what little could still be identified. The bones, dozens of them, were found to be human, most belonging to young women. But there were older ones too. Children, men, even infants. It wasn't a cabin anymore, it was a feeding den. The journal pages, once dried and pieced together, told fragments of a horrifying story. It wasn't written by one person. The handwriting shifted across entries, some scratched in mud, others carved with a blade. But the oldest entries, the ones written in a woman's shaky hand, revealed the beginning. Winter, 1869. "My boys are starving. The crops failed again. The soldiers took what little we had. I hear them crying at night. I cannot bury another child." Then, the writing grew jagged. Desperate. They said the woods could give us what we needed. The mountain spirits who feast under the roots. I heard their song in my dreams. They promised meat, warmth, and life everlasting if I gave them one thing, the flesh of those who wander too close. The last page was smeared with blood. "My sons ate their first meal tonight." When Hank read that line, he nearly dropped the paper. The coroner leaned over and whispered, "You think the brothers? They're still out there?" Hank's face hardened. "No, I think they never left." That night, the sheriff sat at the local tavern, poring over maps of the Ozarks. A man named Luther Dodd, the oldest trapper in the county, approached quietly. He was missing 3 fingers and carried a shotgun older than himself. "You found their place, didn't ya?" Luther rasped. Hank nodded slowly. "You know about them?" Luther's eyes went distant. "Ain't just 2 brothers, Sheriff. There were 5 once. The woman who bore 'em, she wasn't right in the head. Said she was married to a creature made of bark and bone. Folks said she disappeared into the hollow one night and came back pregnant." Hank frowned. "And the others? 3 died during that harsh winter. The 2 that lived, they changed. Started walking on all 4s, speaking in tongues no man knew. They hunted at night. Ate what they caught." The sheriff leaned closer. "You ever see them yourself?" Luther hesitated, then nodded. "Aye, once. 1901, summer night. Thought it was a bear at first. Then I saw its eyes, human eyes, glowing from the dark. And behind it, another, smaller. Both naked. Both watching me breathe." He swallowed hard. "They didn't chase me. Just smiled, wide, like they knew something I didn't. That's when I left this valley and never came back." Hank clenched his jaw. "Well, I'm not leaving. Those boys murdered half this county's women. Someone's got to stop them." Luther gave a bitter laugh. "Stop them? Sheriff, they don't die like men. You can shoot, burn, or bury them. They always come back. You don't kill hunger, son. You just feed it." That evening, as Hank rode home through the woods, a heavy mist rolled in again. Thick, choking, unnaturally cold. His horse stopped abruptly, nostrils flaring. From the tree line came a sound, low, wet breathing. Then, a voice, childlike, cracked, whispering his name. "Sheriff, come eat with us." He turned toward the sound. And there, between the trees, stood 2 figures, pale, gaunt, covered in mud and blood. Their mouths stretched too wide, revealing teeth that didn't look human anymore. One of them held something dripping in his hand. a jawbone freshly torn. Before Hank could reach for his gun, they vanished into the fog, leaving only the sound of laughter echoing through the hollow. That was the last anyone saw of Sheriff Hank Laramie. 3 days later, his horse was found outside the station, reins torn, eyes wide in terror, and tied to its saddle was a small, mud-stained note written in a child's hand. "The feast has begun again." The valley went silent after Sheriff Hank Laramie disappeared. No one ventured near Dead Man's Hollow again, not even the bounty hunters who'd once bragged about chasing ghosts for money. But in the nearby town of Miller's Crossing, whispers began. Women missing from their porches, dogs found flayed, bones arranged in strange symbols. And one morning, a jar appeared on the steps of the church. Inside it, a human tongue. The preacher swore it moved. A month later, a traveling botanist named Elias Finch arrived from St. Louis. He was researching bloodroot, a plant said to grow only where tragedy soaked the soil. Locals warned him not to go near the Ozark hollows, but Elias was the kind of man who didn't believe in folklore until it started believing in him. On his second night in the forest, he made camp near a creek. The air was unnaturally still, and every sound, the wind, the crickets, even his heartbeat, felt muffled, like the woods were listening. He bent down to collect a sample from the ground, but what he saw froze him in place. The roots, they were red. Not red like flowers, but like veins, pulsing faintly as if alive. When he touched one, the soil trembled, and somewhere in the darkness, something giggled. Elias turned, his lantern trembling in his grip. 2 figures stood beyond the tree line, thin, naked, covered in filth and scars that looked burned into their skin. They were whispering, back and forth, like they were sharing a private joke. And then one of them spoke, in a voice that was both child and beast. "Mother said you'd come, the one who loves the bloodroots." Elias stumbled back. "Who are you?" They stepped closer, and that's when he saw their faces, hollow-cheeked, with eyes like wet glass and mouths torn into permanent grins. We're what the mountain made when it got hungry. Elias ran. He didn't stop until he reached an abandoned chapel hidden beneath a ridge. Inside, the walls were covered in carvings, spirals, symbols, and words written in dried blood. At the altar lay dozens of jars, each holding something unspeakable. Hearts, tongues, and bits of bone wrapped in cloth. But what caught his eye was the book lying open in the center, a journal, written in the same trembling hand as the one found in the cabin. It told of a ritual. To feed the mountain and keep it sleeping, we offer what it desires most, flesh of kin, bound by love and blood. The sons must take the mother's body and be reborn as one. The next pages were smeared and unreadable, except for one clear sentence. When the blood roots bloom red again, the brothers will rise to feed. Suddenly, Elias heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind the altar. He turned his lantern. And there stood a woman. Or what was left of one. Her skin was pale as wax, her eyes white and blind. Her hair fell to her knees, matted with dirt. She smiled, revealing blackened teeth. "You shouldn't have come, Elias. You woke them." He stumbled back, stammering. Who are you?" She lifted her hand, and on her wrist was a faded brand burned into the flesh. "MV, their mother," she whispered. "And soon, yours too." Before Elias could react, the ground split open beneath the chapel floor. The roots, the red, pulsing roots, slithered upward, wrapping around his ankles, dragging him toward the altar. The woman began to sing in a low, rasping voice, the same song the old journal had mentioned. "Sleep, my sons, the feast begins. Blood for the root, flesh for the wind." Elias screamed as the roots pulled him under. The lantern fell and shattered, igniting the altar. The fire spread fast, licking the blood-soaked walls, and for a moment the chapel was a glowing womb of flame and bone. When the townsfolk found the ruins the next morning, all that remained were ashes, and a patch of red flowers blooming where the altar once stood. By the next new moon, the disappearances started again. Every victim had one thing in common. Each had red soil under their fingernails. The mountain was feeding again. The fire that consumed the chapel should have ended everything. That's what the people of Miller's Crossing told themselves. That's what the preacher said in every sermon. And yet, when night fell and the wind crept through the valley, the sound returned. Faint at first, like children humming a lullaby just beneath the earth. Locals called it the Hollow Choir. No one dared say it aloud after sunset. The mayor, desperate to calm the panic, hired a team of men to seal the mountain. Among them was Jonas Reed, a Civil War veteran who didn't believe in ghosts, but he believed in the look of fear in people's eyes. He'd seen it too many times. They rode out at dawn with dynamite, ropes, and a priest who refused to bless the land, saying, "You can't sanctify something the devil built himself." By noon, they reached the ridge where the old chapel once stood. The ashes were gone. In their place was a perfect circle of red blooms, swaying though there was no wind. Jonas stepped closer, frowning. The soil wasn't dirt anymore. It was soft like flesh. One of the men, Silas, joked nervously, "Hell, maybe them flowers are growing straight out of the preacher." No one laughed. They began drilling holes for the charges, but the deeper they dug, the wetter the ground became, slick and dark, reeking of copper. Jonas knelt to inspect it. His lantern light caught movement in the soil, something pulsing. He reached in with his knife and pulled back a long, fibrous cord that looked disturbingly like a vein. It twitched, then the ground breathed. A low moan rippled beneath their boots, like the sound of an enormous lung exhaling. The red flowers began to wither and bleed, seeping crimson sap that pooled around their ankles. "Jonas!" Silas shouted. "The fuse!" They lit the charge and ran for the ridge, diving behind rocks. The explosion thundered through the valley, dirt, ash, and roots flying high into the gray sky. When the smoke cleared, they saw the mountain split open. What should have been stone was instead bone-white, honeycombed with holes. From each hole came a sound, soft, mournful, human. The choir. That night, back in Miller's Crossing, the wind carried that same sound through every street. It wasn't just humming anymore, it was voices. Men, women, and children, all whispering the same line. "Feed the roots. Feed the blood." Jonas couldn't sleep. He sat in his room, revolver on the table, listening as the voices crept closer to his window. When he finally glanced outside, he saw lanterns. Dozens of them, bobbing through the fog. The townsfolk. Their eyes were closed. Their mouths moved in perfect unison, singing that same unholy lullaby. Jonas shouted for them to wake up, but they didn't hear. They just kept walking, toward the ridge. He followed, terrified. At the base of the mountain, the people stopped. They formed a circle around the crater left by the dynamite. One by one, they knelt and began digging with their bare hands, bleeding into the soil. Jonas tried to pull them back, but when he touched one of them, the schoolteacher, Mrs. Abbott, she turned her head slowly, her eyes milky white. "He's awake now," she whispered. The mountain heard the song. The ground began to quake. Something massive was moving beneath them, the same pulsing rhythm, louder, faster, like a heartbeat beneath the earth. The red roots burst from the soil, wrapping around the townsfolk, pulling them downward. Jonas fired his gun again and again, but the roots didn't stop. He ran until his lungs burned. Behind him, the singing continued, hundreds of voices now, echoing through the hills. When dawn came, the valley was empty. No people, no houses, just red soil and the faint outline of a spiral burned into the ground. 3 days later, a train conductor passing through the region reported something strange. On the mountainside, just before sunrise, he saw figures standing among the trees, unmoving. He described them as pale, like statues, their faces tilted upward toward the light. And when the wind blew, he swore he heard them singing, a sound that rattled the windows of his locomotive. It wasn't music, he said. It was hunger. The winter that followed was the coldest in living memory. Snow buried the Ozarks in silence, muffling the screams that used to haunt the wind. By the time spring came, the valley had changed. Miller's Crossing was gone from every new map. The train no longer stopped there. The name was erased from postal records as if the town had never existed. But one person remembered, Clara Laramie, the sheriff's widow. She'd lived alone on the outskirts, just beyond the frozen creek. Her husband, Sheriff Hank, had gone into that hollow months before and never come back. She still heard him calling her name in her sleep, a low, broken whisper that made her wake with blood in her ears. On the first thaw of 1902, she packed a lantern, her late husband's revolver, and a bundle of letters written in his handwriting. The last one read simply, "If the singing stops, follow the light." And so she did. Clara trekked through the half-buried road that once led to Miller's Crossing. The snow was streaked red where the blood roots had surfaced again, glistening like open wounds. Every step felt watched, the trees bending ever so slightly toward her as she passed. By nightfall, she reached the ridge, or what was left of it. The crater had widened. The earth had collapsed inward, forming a spiral valley of black soil and fog. At the center burned something faint, a single light flickering like a candle in the dark. She raised her lantern, whispering, "Hank?" A voice echoed faintly back, carried by the wind. "Follow the light." Her knees buckled. It was him. She descended. As she moved deeper into the hollow, the air grew thick, heavy with rot and iron. The ground squelched beneath her boots. Everywhere she looked, the red roots pulsed faintly under the soil, like veins beneath transparent skin. Half buried in the dirt were shapes, arms, legs, faces, pale and motionless, fused into the ground as if the mountain had swallowed them mid-breath. But one of them was still moving, a man's hand, twitching weakly. Clara dropped her lantern and dug. It was Hank. Or what was left of him. His face was half covered in dirt, his skin ashen, his eyes clouded white. Yet he smiled when he saw her. "You came," he croaked. "You heard the song," Clara sobbed, clutching his hand. "We'll get you out. Just hold on." But Hank only shook his head. "You can't dig me free. I'm part of it now." "We all are." The earth beneath them trembled, and his voice deepened, layering with others, hundreds of others. "The roots feed on what remembers. That's why you came. That's why you'll stay." She backed away, heart hammering as the soil around her began to move, breathing again, rising in waves. From the fog, faint lanterns began to appear. 1, 2, then dozens, each carried by a figure. Women, men, children, faces pale, blank mouths half open in song, and each of them wore the same faint smile Hank did. "We're not gone," they whispered together. "We're growing." Clara raised her revolver, trembling. "Stay back!" But the lanterns moved closer. Their light merged into one blinding glow until the entire hollow shimmered red and gold. And in that glow, she saw what lay beneath the soil. A face. Vast, ancient, carved into the very earth. Its eyes closed, its mouth open in an endless scream. It was the mountain itself, and from that mouth came the choir's final note. A low, endless hum that made the lanterns burst, one by one, until only Clara's remained. The next morning, a hunting party found her wandering near the ridge. Her clothes were torn, her skin burned by frost and something else, like ash. She carried a single lantern. Inside it, instead of a flame, was a small red flower that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. When the men tried to take it from her, she whispered, "If it goes out, they'll wake again." She never spoke after that. Locals called her the Lantern Widow. For years, she roamed the hills, lighting fires wherever the ground began to bleed, whispering to the fog as if calming something unseen. They say that when she finally died, the lantern she carried didn't go out. It just drifted away into the mist, joining the others. When the Lantern Widow disappeared into the fog, the people of southern Missouri thought the nightmare had ended. But nightmares don't end. They spread. By late summer of 1902, smoke began rising from the Ozark Valley again, thick, gray, and laced with a strange, sweet smell that made livestock collapse where they stood. Rain turned black. Corn rotted in the fields overnight. And anyone who went near the old Miller's Crossing Ridge came back coughing up ash. Locals called it the ash harvest. In Jefferson City, reports started piling up: infestation, chemical bloom, mass hysteria. The state sent a team of investigators led by Captain Walter Hensley, a veteran of the Spanish-American War. He wasn't a believer in ghosts or curses, but after the Plattsburgh mine incident, where 40 men vanished without trace, he'd learned that belief wasn't required for something to kill you. Hensley's orders were simple: contain whatever's happening in the Ozarks. Burn it if you must. The team arrived in the ruins of a nearby hamlet called Birch Hollow, 10 miles from the ridge. The houses were half collapsed, roofs sagging under the weight of black dust. Not a sound, no dogs, no wind, no birds. The only thing moving was the ash. It drifted across the ground like mist, piling against doors, slipping through windows. When one soldier stepped into it, his boot sank an inch. He yanked it free and screamed. The ash clung to him like tar, eating through the leather, blistering the skin beneath. "Don't touch it," Hensley barked. "Stay on the boards." They laid planks between buildings and made their way toward what had once been the church. Inside, they found every pew stacked neatly against the walls, the altar stripped bare. And on the floor, carved deep into the wood, was the spiral. The same spiral Jonas Reed's team had seen before the choir consumed them. At the center sat a lantern. Its glass was cracked, but the flame still burned red. The youngest private, Mills, whispered, "That's hers, sir." "The widow's." Hensley crouched, inspecting the lantern. The flame pulsed faintly, almost in rhythm with his own heartbeat. He reached out, and the moment his fingers brushed the handle, the flame flared bright, then vanished. The room went silent. Then came the humming, low at first, then louder, swelling until it filled every corner of the church. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from underneath. The wooden floor began to bow upward. Ash poured from the cracks like smoke escaping a furnace. The men backed away, rifles raised, as someone pushed through. A figure rose from the floorboards. Its face was caked in gray, its eyes glowing faintly red beneath the soot. When it opened its mouth, ash spilled out in a stream. Then another figure rose. And another. Dozens of them, crawling from beneath the church, the houses, the streets. People of Miller's Crossing. Their bodies fused with the earth, their skin rough like bark. They moved as one. Hensley fired first. The bullet tore through the figure. No blood, just dust. The body stumbled but didn't fall. It looked at him, tilting its head as if remembering something. "Feed the roots," it rasped. "Feed the blood." The men ran for their wagons, but the ash followed, swirling through the air, choking their horses, clogging their rifles. By the time Hensley reached the ridge, only 3 men were left. He looked back. The entire valley was glowing red beneath the fog, and from that glow, a sound, faint, melodic, almost beautiful. The choir! Singing again. Hensley dropped to his knees, clutching his head. "We have to burn it," he muttered. All of it. He struck a match, tossed it into the ash. The flame caught, and for the first time, the mountain screamed. A deep, guttural roar that shook the ground and split the sky with lightning. The soldiers fled, but the fire didn't spread outward. It spread down. Into the ground. Into the roots. When the smoke cleared, the valley was nothing but black glass and silence. Weeks later, Jefferson City received a single telegram. No sender. Just one sentence. "The ash still breathes." The winter of 1902 fell upon the Ozarks like a curse. The trees stood naked and twisted, their shadows cutting through the fog like skeletal hands reaching for the living. Few dared to travel through the mountain passes that season, not because of the cold, but because of what people whispered was waiting in the hollows. The stories had spread faster than wildfire. Hunters spoke of seeing shapes moving between the trees, hunched, long-limbed silhouettes dragging something heavy behind them. Women in nearby towns whispered of screams echoing through the pines late at night, followed by the sound of chains rattling against frozen ground. And always there was talk of the brothers, the feral men who lived deep in the woods, once human, but now something else. Something wild, something wrong. One night, an old trapper named Eli Boone decided to find out if the stories were true. He'd lost his niece, Clara, 2 months earlier. She'd been on her way home from church when she vanished without a trace. Folks said she'd been taken by the woods. Eli didn't believe in monsters, but he did believe in men capable of monstrous things. He carried a lantern and a rifle as he trudged into the thick snow, following faint footprints that led up the ridge. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest trace of laughter. Not a joyful laughter. A shrill, cracked kind, like the voice of someone who hadn't spoken in years. Eli froze. The sound came again, closer this time. He turned slowly toward a narrow path leading into a ravine. His lantern light flickered against something on the ground. A shoe, small, mud-caked. Clara's. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward, the snow crunching softly under his boots, and found a rope lying half buried in the frost. It led down into the dark hollow below. And as he followed it, something moved ahead of him. A shadow. Then another. Then 2 sets of glowing eyes peered through the darkness. "Who's there?" Eli shouted, raising his rifle. No answer, only the faint sound of panting. The brothers stepped into the light. Their faces were smeared with dirt and ash, their hair tangled like matted fur. Their clothes hung in shreds. And between them, dragging on a chain, was a woman. Barefoot, shivering, her lips blue with cold. Eli's blood ran cold. It wasn't Clara. It was someone else. Someone he'd never seen before. One of the brothers. The taller one, with a grin that split his face from ear to ear, tilted his head and said softly, "You shouldn't have come looking, old man. The woods don't give back what they take." Before Eli could react, the other brother lunged. The lantern fell, shattering against the rocks, and the hollow filled with firelight and screaming. When the flames died down the next morning, the snow was red, and neither Eli nor the brothers were ever seen again. But the locals still speak of that hollow. They say that on certain nights when the fog rolls in thick and the air smells of iron, you can hear the faint sound of chains dragging through the trees, followed by a voice whispering from the dark, "Come on down, brother. Supper's ready." By the spring of 1903, the stories had spread beyond the mountain towns. Farmers refused to hunt. Travelers avoided the passes. Mothers warned their children never to play near the creek, because the creek, they said, carried screams downstream. After Eli Boone's disappearance, the county finally took notice. Sheriff Henry Lowell, a man too proud to believe in legends, assembled a small team of deputies and trackers. They were joined by a state marshal, Thomas Redden, who had spent years dealing with outlaws and cannibal gangs in the Missouri wilderness. But even he had never seen anything like what they were about to find. The team left at dawn, 5 men on horseback. The fog was still heavy enough to blur the trees into shifting shapes. By noon, they'd reached the ridge where Eli's last tracks were found. Something was wrong the moment they dismounted. No birds, no wind, just silence. A silence so thick it pressed against their eardrums. As they advanced, the stench hit them first. A mix of rot, smoke, and something sour, like meat that had been soaked in river water. Marshal Redden crouched, running his fingers over a pile of bones scattered near the tree line. "These are fresh," he murmured. "Animals?" the sheriff asked. Redden shook his head. "Not unless animals been wearing corsets." The sheriff's face drained of color. The bones weren't just bones. They were arranged. Tiny finger bones placed neatly in rows, like someone had been collecting them. The team followed a trail of footprints down into a ravine until they saw it, the cabin. It was barely standing, its roof sagging, its chimney blackened by years of soot. The windows were boarded from the inside, and animal skulls hung from the porch beams. One of the deputies muttered a prayer. Another crossed himself. Marshal Redden raised his rifle. "Move slow," he whispered. "They're in there." The sheriff kicked the door open. What they saw inside would scar them forever. The walls were alive with skins. Dozens, no, hundreds of human hides stretched flat and tacked like wallpaper. Some still had hair, tattoos, even birthmarks. There were women's dresses folded neatly in a corner, caked with dried blood. Chains hung from the ceiling, ending in manacles, each one stained dark. And in the center of the room stood a crude table. On it, a rotted feast. Bones, meat, flies, swarming thick. A voice came from the shadows. "You brought guests." "We ain't had guests in a long time." The brothers stepped forward. They were thinner now, almost skeletal. Their skin gray from filth, their teeth jagged from chewing bone. Their eyes gleamed like those of cornered animals, but there was something calculated behind that madness. Marshal Redden aimed his rifle. "Down on the ground," the taller brother grinned. "You think this is our home?" "Nah, this is just our kitchen." A gunshot rang out, then another. The cabin erupted in chaos. Bullets tore through the wooden walls. One deputy went down screaming. The sheriff fired into the dark, hitting something that howled and dropped out of sight. Then, the floor collapsed. The team fell into the cellar below, landing in a pit of cold, wet flesh. The stench was unbearable. Lantern light flickered against hundreds of bones, arranged in piles like trophies. Some were still fresh. And in the corner, chained to a beam, a woman stirred weakly. Her body covered in bruises, her mouth sewn shut. Marshal Redden cut her free, but she clutched his arm with desperate eyes and shook her head violently. "Leave," she tried to whisper through the stitches. "They're not dead." He turned and saw movement in the rafters. The brothers dropped from above, shrieking like animals. The fight that followed was chaos. Blood, splintered wood, screams echoing through the cellar. When the gunfire stopped, only the sheriff and Marshal Redden were left standing. One brother was dead, throat blown open. The other was gone, vanished into the tunnels beneath the floor. They burned the cabin to the ground that night. But as the flames roared, Redden noticed something strange. The cellar door had been pushed open from below, and in the mud leading into the woods were fresh footprints. 2 sets, one large, one smaller. The official report claimed both brothers were killed, but locals swore they still heard laughter in the woods on stormy nights, the same cracked, feral laughter that echoed after every disappearance. Some say the surviving brother found someone new. A boy taught him how to skin, how to lure, how to feed, and they say that's why, even today, the Ozarks keep their secrets, because some families never die out. The Ozarks were quiet for nearly 2 decades after the Vancroft brothers vanished. The woods grew thick again, swallowing the burned cabin and all its horrors beneath moss and thyme. Locals avoided that stretch of mountain, calling it the Hollow of Whispers. No one built there. No one hunted there. But sometimes, hunters swore they saw smoke rising through the trees, thin, gray, and silent, curling toward the sky from a place where no one should have been living. By 1922, the new generation had almost forgotten the stories. Almost. That summer, a boy named Jesse Marlin, age 17, vanished while fishing along the creek near Devil's Bend. He'd told his mother he was going to bring back trout for supper. His body was never found, just his fishing pole snapped clean in two and a trail of blood leading into the woods. Sheriff Henry Lowell had died years before, but his grandson, Deputy Sam Lowell, took it upon himself to reopen the old Vancroft file. What he discovered in those yellowed pages made his hands tremble. The drawings, crude sketches of human remains, chains, tunnels, and one note written in the margin by Marshal Redden himself. One escaped. I think he took something with him, or someone. Sam spent weeks retracing his grandfather's route, camping alone near the old Vancroft ruins. Locals thought he was insane. The elders warned him that the woods weren't empty, that the young one never left, but Sam didn't believe in curses. Until the third night. It started with footsteps outside his tent, soft, deliberate, circling. Then came the smell, that same sour metallic scent that the old reports had described. He unzipped the flap just enough to peer out. The moonlight was pale and silver, stretching across the clearing. And there, about 30 feet away, stood a figure. It was small, like a child, maybe 10, maybe 12, naked, head tilted. Its skin was the color of wet ash, and its eyes were empty, milky white. "Hey," Sam shouted, rifle raised. The thing didn't move. It just turned its head sharply, almost in curiosity, and then bolted into the trees on all fours, faster than any human could run. Sam fired once. The echo rolled across the valley. Silence. Then, from deep in the woods came the faintest sound. Laughter. The next morning, Sam followed a trail of tiny footprints to a collapsed section of the earth. Beneath the dirt and weeds, he found the mouth of an old tunnel. It smelled like rot and damp air. It led underground, far beneath the surface. He tied a rope to a tree and climbed down. The deeper he went, the colder it became. The walls were carved stone, slick with moss. Strange symbols, circles, and stick figures were scratched into the rock, each one drawn with what looked like dried blood. Then he found bones. Small ones. Child-sized. Dozens of them, and beyond that, a chamber. There were candles, melted into the dirt. Skulls arranged in a pattern. And in the middle, a wooden cradle. Inside that cradle lay something wrapped in leather. Sam leaned closer, unwrapping it, and froze. It was a mask. Human skin, stretched thin, with eye holes crudely cut. He dropped it in horror, and from behind him came a whisper. "You shouldn't have touched that." Sam spun around. Standing in the entrance of the tunnel was the same pale figure from the night before, only now he could see it clearly. It wasn't a boy at all. Its skin had been stitched together, patchwork pieces from different bodies. Its jaw was too wide, its arms too long. But what froze Sam was the necklace it wore, a sheriff's badge, rusted and bent. It grinned at him. "Family stays together." The lantern flickered. And in that brief darkness, dozens of whispers filled the chamber. Voices of men, women, children, all humming the same phrase in unison. "Family stays together. Family stays together." When rescue parties arrived 3 days later, they found Sam's horse tied to a tree, but no sign of him. The tunnel mouth was sealed by rocks, as if it had never been there. Only one thing remained at the campsite. A small wooden cradle, empty, except for the sheriff's badge inside. That fall, 3 more people vanished near Devil's Bend. Each one left behind a single clue, a handprint smeared in ash, smaller than a child's, and locals began whispering again. The young one's still out there. Only now he's not alone. By the time the 1940s rolled through the Ozarks, the Vancroft name had all but vanished from official records. The land had been swallowed by government repossession acts, and the old homestead had been marked as a condemned geological zone. Locals still didn't go near Devil's Bend, not because of superstition, but because anyone who did simply didn't come back. But then came the New Deal logging project. The government sent a small team of men to survey the forest for potential timber roads. They were led by a man named Richard Callahan, a forestry engineer from St. Louis, city-bred, logical, and utterly dismissive of Appalachian ghost tales. The men arrived in early October 1941. 4 loggers, 2 engineers, and 1 camp cook. Their first night was calm. The air smelled like pine and wet soil. But by the second night, the forest began to change. The men kept hearing it, a tapping sound, faint but rhythmic, coming from somewhere deep in the woods. At first, they thought it was woodpeckers, until the tapping grew into a knocking. Then came the voices. Children laughing. A woman humming. Always distant, always moving just out of the firelight. Richard didn't believe it. He assumed one of the crew was drinking, maybe trying to spook the others. But then, on the 4th night, one of the loggers, Eddie Burns, vanished. They found his boots the next morning, neatly placed outside his tent. Next to them was a small wooden carving of a cradle. By day 6, the men wanted out. But the nearest town was a 2-day walk, and the radio was dead. That night, Richard decided to keep watch by the fire with his rifle ready. The woods were silent for hours. Then, the air shifted. From beyond the tree line, something began moving. Not like an animal. Too steady. Too synchronized. Shapes emerged from the fog. 4 figures. At first, they looked like men. But as they came closer, Richard realized they were all wrong. Their faces were smooth, too smooth, as if stretched over bone without features. Their clothes were old, tattered, soaked in something dark. And each one carried something in their hands. Crude wooden cradles, swinging softly, empty. Richard raised his rifle. "Stop right there," he yelled. The figures didn't stop. One of them tilted its head. And from beneath that skin mask came a voice, cracked and distant. "You shouldn't have come back here, Sheriff." Richard froze. No one in the camp had mentioned the old Lowell family. No one even knew the stories. And yet, that voice knew. He fired once. The shot echoed through the trees. The figures didn't fall. They simply faded back into the fog, the sound of the wooden cradles creaking as they vanished. By dawn, the men packed what little they could and fled down the logging path, but the forest didn't let them go. The mist thickened. The air grew cold. One by one, the crew disappeared into the haze, their screams muffled by the trees. Richard was the only one who made it out. He stumbled into a ranger station, delirious, covered in scratches, whispering the same phrase over and over. They said family stays together. He died in a St. Louis asylum 6 months later. When officials returned to investigate the site, they found the logging camp destroyed, tents shredded, tools scattered. No footprints, no bodies, just 7 small cradles, carved by hand, hanging from the branches above the campfire pit. Decades later, hikers still report strange sounds near Devil's Bend. A tapping, a child's laughter, and sometimes, a man's voice whispering in the wind. The family's home now. By the mid-1970s, the Devil's Bend region had become a ghost map. There were no paved roads, no homes, and even the park rangers refused to patrol more than a mile in. But there was one man who couldn't let it go, a St. Louis journalist named Earl Maddox, known for chasing cold cases that everyone else had long since buried. He'd read an old clipping while researching missing person cases. Deputy Lowell vanishes in Ozarks, 1922. The article mentioned the Vancroft brothers by name. What caught Earl's attention was the editor's note scrawled in pencil across the margin. See Asylum Report, Callahan, 1942. They said family stays together. The words crawled into Earl's brain and refused to leave. So in the fall of 1976, he packed a camera, a tape recorder, and a box of maps, and he drove his rust-red pickup into the Missouri backwoods. 1. The return to Devil's Bend. The first locals he met at the gas station didn't talk, they warned. Don't go near that valley, the clerk said, eyes darting to the window. At night, you can hear babies crying. But they ain't babies. Earl smiled politely, pretending to jot notes, but when he looked back, the man had already walked away. The forest swallowed his truck whole. The deeper he drove, the quieter the world became. No birds, no wind, only the crunch of gravel and the slow creak of his tires. By dusk, he found the old sign. Miller's Hollow, population 0. He set up camp near the dried creek bed. The silence was so complete, he could hear his heartbeat. When he switched on his tape recorder, the hiss of static felt almost comforting. Field log, October 21st, 1976. Day 1. Locals say the Vancroft brothers were inbred recluses who vanished in 1901 after a string of disappearances. There are reports of their descendants seen decades later. Objective. Confirm or debunk. Then, faintly, through the static, another voice whispered. Soft, childlike, and wrong. Welcome back. Earl froze. He replayed the tape twice. The whisper stayed. 2. The records beneath the church. The next day, he found the ruins of an old chapel. Inside, half buried under dust and ivy, were church ledgers. He flipped through brittle pages until a name caught his eye. Vancroft William, married to Mary Ellen Lowell, 1899. Lowell. The sheriff's family. That meant the families were linked. The lawman and the monsters, bound by blood. Tucked between the pages was a photograph, a wedding portrait. The groom's eyes were blurred from age, but the bride's face was perfectly preserved. Pale, expressionless, and familiar. He turned the photo over. A handwritten note read, "The family keeps what it loves." A cold wind blew through the broken church window, carrying the faint sound of humming. Earl shut the ledger and backed away. 3. The hollow at night. That night he lit a small fire and replayed the recordings from earlier. Between the crackles of static were voices, dozens of them, overlapping in a slow chant. Family stays together, family stays together. Then came laughter, children's laughter, echoing from somewhere behind him. He turned, flashlight trembling. The beam caught a figure standing by the trees. A young girl in a tattered dress, barefoot, hair matted with mud. "Are you lost?" he asked. She didn't answer. She pointed toward the woods. When he turned his light to follow her gesture, there were others. Shapes moving among the trees, eyes glinting like glass marbles. Earl ran for his truck, heart hammering. When he reached it, every window was fogged from the inside. On the glass, written with a finger, were 2 words. Welcome home. 4. The tape that shouldn't exist. 2 weeks later, Earl's pickup was found abandoned near the highway. The driver's door was open, keys still in the ignition. No blood, no footprints. Inside the glove compartment, deputies found a single cassette labeled The Hollow of Whispers, Final Log. When investigators played it, they heard Earl's voice, panting, whispering into the recorder. They're not ghosts. They're still here. They never died. They breed in the dark. God help anyone who goes near. The tape ended with a child's giggle, followed by 3 knocks. Then silence. 5. Aftermath. The state sealed off Devil's Bend again, citing, quote, unstable ground conditions. But the rangers who patrol the border at night still hear things. The sound of a lullaby drifting through the trees, or the faint creak of wood like a cradle swaying somewhere in the dark. Every decade or so, someone goes missing. A camper, a hunter, a journalist, and each time, their vehicle turns up abandoned, a small wooden carving left on the driver's seat. A cradle. Empty. The day after the thunderstorm, the Ozark forest looked deceptively calm, golden sunlight dripping through wet leaves, the faint mist curling over the ground like breath. But beneath that quiet surface, something still moved. Sheriff Warren and Father Doyle returned to the clearing with 4 men, each carrying a lantern and a rifle. The air was sour with the smell of wet earth and decay. Stay close, Warren warned. They know these woods better than any of us. The group advanced slowly. The cabin still stood, the porch now sagging inward, a crow perched on the roof's edge. Inside, the air felt heavy, the scent of mold, blood, and rot fused together. Flies buzzed lazily over the table where the brothers' strange trinkets were laid out. Bones, teeth, hair tied in bundles. Father Doyle picked up a small wooden carving, a woman's face distorted in terror. He turned it over and saw initials carved on the back. M.L. Mary Lou, he whispered. One of the missing girls. The sheriff's men found a trapdoor behind a loose board near the hearth. It opened to a set of stone steps leading down, cold air rising up from below. Warren raised his lantern. All right, boys. Let's end this. The basement smelled of rust and old iron. Chains dangled from the ceiling, slick with something dark. Straw beds lined the floor, and at the far end of the room, a wooden door. Something moved behind it. Warren aimed his gun. Come out. No response. Only slow, uneven breathing. He pushed the door open and saw a man, pale and trembling, sitting in a cage. His eyes were wide, terrified. Don't let them in, he whispered hoarsely. They ain't dead, they just sleepin'. Suddenly, a crash echoed from upstairs. Boots thudded. One of the deputies screamed. Warren spun toward the stairs. Go! When they reached the main floor, the front door was swinging open. The crow was gone. Outside, the forest was silent. No wind, no birds. And then, faintly, they heard it, singing, a woman's voice. Sweet, childlike, coming from the trees. Come along, brothers dear. Supper's near. The deputies froze. Father Doyle gripped his cross, his lips trembling with prayer. But from the tree line, 2 shapes emerged. Tall, barefoot, covered in mud and leaves. Their faces were pale as wax, their eyes black pits of hunger. Holy God, Warren muttered. They're still alive. The brothers smiled. And the forest began to whisper. The woods were alive with whispers that night. The wind didn't move, but the trees seemed to breathe, their leaves trembling with a pulse of their own. Sheriff Warren's lantern flickered as he raised his revolver. The 2 brothers, bare-chested, hair matted with dirt and blood, stood barely 10 yards away. Their smiles stretched too wide, teeth blackened, skin marked with old cuts and strange runes burned into their flesh. Stay back! Warren shouted. But the brothers didn't move. The taller one, Elias, tilted his head. Y'all shouldn't have come here, Sheriff, he said, his voice thick and slurred, like something unused to human speech. You woke the forest. Father Doyle gripped his crucifix tighter. Your abominations, he hissed. But the shorter brother, Caleb, just giggled. Ain't abominations. We're chosen. Before anyone could react, Caleb darted forward, fast as a shadow. His hand slammed into the nearest deputy's throat. The man dropped his lantern, choking. The fire caught on the dry moss, and the forest floor began to burn in a wide, glowing circle. Shoot! Warren roared. Gunfire cracked through the silence. The bullets hit. Elias staggered back, but he didn't fall. He reached down, yanked a slug from his chest, and grinned. The others ran for the cabin, dragging the wounded deputy. The fire spread quickly, illuminating the brothers in orange light, their bodies slick with mud and blood, the smoke rising like a crown above them. Inside the cabin, Doyle grabbed a flask of holy water. We can't kill them, he said. Not the way we think. They've been fed by something older. Something that lives beneath these woods. The sheriff stared at him. Then how do we stop it? Doyle pointed toward the floorboards. You seal the mouth. You cut off the offering. The priest knelt and began to pray, chanting in Latin, sprinkling holy water on the boards. The cabin trembled. From below, they heard a low moaning sound, like wind dragging through a throat. Outside, Elias screamed. Stop it! The brothers clawed at the burning doorway, their skin blistering but not tearing. The earth around them began to buckle, the soil writhing like it was alive. Doyle shouted over the noise, Finish it! Drive the nails! The men grabbed iron spikes from the tool chest and hammered them into the boards. Each strike echoed like thunder. As the last spike went in, a blinding white light filled the cabin. The sound stopped. When the smoke cleared, the brothers were gone. Only the smell of burnt soil and wet wood remained. The priest collapsed. It sealed for now. Warren looked out the window. The forest was silent again. But deep in the trees, faintly, he could still hear that same soft song. Supper's near. He turned to Doyle. You said for now. What happens when it wakes again? The priest didn't answer. He only looked toward the distant hills where the mist rolled low and dark, as though the forest itself were still breathing. And somewhere beneath that silence, under the roots and dirt, the brothers smiled in the dark. The Ozark Mountains lay still beneath a silver dawn. For over a century, the forest had swallowed the screams of the Vancroft brothers. Their cabin rotted into the earth, their graves forgotten by time. But evil doesn't die. It waits. It remembers. It was late October 2023. 3 friends, Mason, Aaron, and Tyler, were filming a low-budget exploration vlog called Forgotten Trails. They specialized in abandoned places and local legends, and when Mason stumbled upon a rumor about the Vancroft settlement, he knew it was gold for their channel. They found a faded news clipping online. 2 brothers, Levi and Jonah Vancroft, suspected in a string of disappearances, presumed dead after their cabin fire in 1901. Bodies never recovered. Aaron laughed when she read it. Classic ghost story bait, she said, zipping her jacket. Let's make this one our Halloween special. By sunset, they were deep in the Ozarks, their phones flickering between signal and static. The trees seemed unnaturally close, branches bending, whispering against one another like old bones grinding in the dark. They found the ruins just before dusk. Half buried in moss, the stone foundation of what once was the Vancroft cabin lay open like a scar in the earth. And right at the center, a rusted iron door leading downward. Tyler swept his flashlight over it. No way! That's a cellar door, Mason grinned. Exactly what I was hoping for. Aaron hesitated. This isn't funny. It smells like something's dead down there. They pried the door open, the hinges screaming like an animal in pain. The air that poured out was thick and damp, like the breath of something long buried. They climbed down. The flashlight beams danced across the dirt walls. And there, scrawled in faded red letters, were words that made their stomachs turn. We never left. Tyler chuckled nervously. Okay, who's screwing with us? But then Mason's camera began to flicker. A face flashed in the static. 2 pale eyes. A grin too wide to be human. A cold wind tore through the cellar, and every candle Aaron had lit went out at once. When they scrambled out of the hole, the forest had gone silent. No crickets, no wind. Only the faint echo of whispering, deep, rhythmic, almost like chanting from somewhere in the trees. Aaron turned to Mason. Did you hear that? But Mason's eyes were unfocused, his lips moving silently. Tyler stepped closer, voice shaking. Mason, what are you saying? Then Mason spoke clearly. A voice not his own. The blood remembers. Something cracked in the woods behind them. Something big. And when they turned their lights toward the sound, the beam fell upon 2 figures standing just beyond the tree line. Both were impossibly tall, their faces hidden beneath burlap sacks. Their movements were wrong, jerky, puppet-like, as if controlled by unseen strings. Aaron screamed. Tyler grabbed her arm, but Mason just stared, whispering. They found us. The camera dropped to the ground, still recording. Through the lens, the world tilted sideways. The figures moved closer. The recording ended there. But 2 weeks later, a hiker found their abandoned tent near the Vancroft ruins. Inside, the only trace left was Mason's camera. When police recovered the footage, every frame was warped, distorted, except one. At the very end, just before the camera cut out, a new line had appeared on the cellar wall, drawn in fresh blood. Welcome back. The curse of the Vancroft brothers had begun again. By the time the footage of Forgotten Trails reached the local sheriff's office, Dry Creek had already begun to change. It started small. Animals vanishing from their pens, dogs howling at nothing in the dead of night, windows breaking in empty homes. Locals blamed wild boars, trespassers, even teenagers. But the older folks, they whispered another name. The Vancroft boys. Sheriff Caleb Horn didn't believe in ghosts. He'd grown up hearing the same backwoods tales every Ozark kid did. witches, hollers that echoed back wrong, and men who'd gone feral in the old mines. But when he saw the camera, that footage, something inside him changed. He couldn't explain the distortion. He couldn't explain why Mason's voice bled through the static, whispering names that matched 3 missing locals. He couldn't explain the shadows that moved against the light. 2 nights later, Caleb drove out to the Vancroft ruins himself. The forest was unnaturally quiet again. Even the crickets refused to sing. His headlights caught the reflection of something metal, the old cellar door, propped open. Caleb raised his gun and called out. "Anyone down there?" Only the wind answered. Then, faintly, from below, he heard it. A woman's voice, soft. Crying, "Help me." He should have radioed for backup. He knew that. But the voice sounded too real. Too human. He descended. The air grew colder with every step. His flashlight flickered across the cellar walls, the same dirt chamber the explorers had filmed. But now there were new carvings. Dozens of handprints, smeared in mud and blood. Some small, some not. And then he saw her. Or what he thought was her. A figure crouched in the far corner, hair hanging over her face. Her dress looked torn, filthy, decades out of time. "Ma'am?" Caleb whispered. The woman lifted her head slowly. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and glassy. And her mouth was sewn shut with black thread. Caleb stumbled back, flashlight shaking. The woman stood. Her movements were stiff, unnatural. The air grew thick, like the cellar itself was breathing. And from the darkness behind her came the low, guttural rasp of another voice. "He's back, our blood, our kin." Caleb fired his weapon once blindly. The muzzle flash lit up 2 figures behind her, tall, broad, their heads covered with sacks, just as described in the footage. The cellar echoed with a sound not human, a deep groaning roar, like the forest itself was waking. Caleb ran. He didn't stop until he reached his car, tires spinning mud as he tore through the woods. When he reached town, the church bells were ringing. But it wasn't Sunday. The townspeople had gathered outside the old chapel, staring up at the steeple. Someone or something had hung Mason's camera there, tied with a length of animal sinew, still dripping. And carved into the wood below it were 3 words that froze everyone where they stood. "The blood lives." That night, Caleb locked himself in his house and pored over the camera files again. One new video had appeared, time-stamped just an hour earlier. It showed his own house. The front door. And behind it, 2 figures. The brothers had returned to town. By the time dawn touched the misty pines, Dry Creek was already changing. Animals had fled the valley. The river turned the color of rust, and the wind carried a low hum, a sound that seemed to move from tree to tree, like a whisper looking for ears. Old-timers said it hadn't sounded like that since the brothers burned. Inside the sheriff's cabin, Caleb Horn hadn't slept. He'd sealed every door and window, drawn every curtain. But the humming, that low, droning sound, wouldn't stop. He looked out toward the forest, and for just a moment he saw it. A light, deep among the trees. Not firelight. It pulsed, slow and rhythmic, as if the forest had a heartbeat. And then, the bells began to ring again. Not the church bells. They'd been torn down years ago. These came from underground. He grabbed his rifle and stepped into the night. Down the old main road, the townspeople were gathering. No one spoke. They just stood there, eyes fixed on the woods at the edge of town. Something was moving out there. Not walking, shifting. The mist parted, and out stepped 3 figures. Their faces were wrapped in burlap, their hands blackened with ash. But what made the people freeze wasn't their appearance. It was what they carried. A wooden crossbeam, carved from oak, etched with strange symbols. They planted it into the ground, and as soon as it struck the dirt, the humming stopped. The silence was worse. The air grew colder. The lanterns around the square dimmed, until only the crossbeam's carvings glowed, pulsing red, like veins. An old woman in the crowd gasped. She fell to her knees, whispering a prayer. "They've come back to finish the covenant." Caleb shoved through the crowd. "Who are you talking about?" But before she could answer, the ground trembled beneath them. A deep rumble rolled through the valley. Not thunder, not an earthquake. Something older. From the edge of the woods came a foul smell, the stench of rot and damp earth. And then, voices. Dozens of them, chanting in a language no one recognized. The burlap-faced figures raised their arms, and the earth split open beneath the crossbeam. Something glowed inside the fissure, a twisting mass of roots and bones. Caleb fired into the air. "Enough!" he shouted. The nearest figure turned its head toward him. Even through the mask, Caleb felt its eyes. and in a low, rasping voice it spoke. "The blood remembers the oath, Sheriff. The woods always keep what's theirs." Then, in one blinding flash, the crossbeam erupted into flame, not orange fire, but cold blue light that burned without smoke. When the light faded, the figures were gone. All that remained was the charred symbol, and a whisper carried by the wind. "Dry Creek will feed the forest again." By the next morning, every tree along the valley ridge bore the same mark, the sigil of the Vancroft curse, etched into their bark as if by invisible hands. Birds refused to fly over the town. Water from the well turned to black sludge. And that night, as Caleb recorded his final statement for the state police, the lights in his cabin flickered, and a voice whispered from the dark corner, "You should have stayed out of the woods." The next morning, Dry Creek woke to silence. No roosters crowed. No wind stirred the branches. Every sound felt smothered, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Sheriff Caleb Horn stood at the edge of town, staring down the main street. Smoke curled lazily from a few chimneys, but not a single person walked the road. Even the dogs that used to wander freely were gone. When he finally stepped into the church, he found the townsfolk there. All of them, men, women, even children, standing perfectly still in the pews. Their eyes were open, staring blankly ahead. And every one of them was humming. It was low at first, barely audible. Then it began to rise, a haunting harmony that seemed to come from deep inside their chests. Caleb shouted, "What's going on?" No one moved. No one blinked. The melody kept swelling, twisting, becoming almost beautiful, until he realized it wasn't made of human tones. It sounded like the forest itself had found a voice. He tried to grab one of the men by the shoulder, Tom Hensley, the blacksmith, but the moment he touched him, Tom's head jerked toward him, mouth stretching open in a silent scream. From his throat poured a black mist that drifted upward, swirling like smoke. It hit the ceiling and vanished into the rafters. Then, one by one, the rest of the congregation did the same. Their humming stopped, their mouths opened, and the black vapor poured out. The church filled with it, thick and heavy, until Caleb could barely breathe. He stumbled outside, gasping for air. And when he turned back, every person inside was gone. Only the echo of their song lingered in the air. That night, the sound spread. First the woods began to hum again, then the houses on the outskirts joined in. Every window glowed faintly red from within. Caleb drove through the streets, siren off, his gun trembling in his hand. He passed by the old hollow bridge, where something impossible happened. The mist began to form shapes. Dozens of faint, transparent figures emerged from the fog, faces half rotted, half real. He could recognize some of them, the missing explorers, the hunters, even a few from his childhood. And among them, the brothers. They stood at the center of the bridge, unmoving, staring at him through the mist. When Caleb raised his flashlight, they didn't flinch. Their mouths moved slowly, in unison, whispering something he couldn't hear. He stepped closer, and then, "Sheriff Horn," one of them said softly. "You've been listening. Now you will sing." Before he could react, the mist rushed forward, into his mouth, into his nose, into his eyes. He dropped his gun, clutching at his throat. The last thing he remembered before everything went dark was the echo of the humming changing. Now it sounded like him, his own voice joining the rest. When morning came, a passing trucker found the sheriff's car idling on the bridge. Empty. The radio was on, and through the static, a single whisper repeated every few seconds. "The choir grows." By the winter of 1902, the valley that held Dry Creek had all but vanished from memory. Rain swallowed the roads, moss overtook the fences, and mapmakers simply left a blank space where the town once stood. But on certain nights, clear, windless, moon-heavy travelers still swore they could hear it. A low humming, like the echo of a far-off choir carried on the fog. Those who dared to follow the sound never found houses or people. Only the outlines of streets traced in dead grass, and a single crossbeam half buried in clay, carved with the ancient Vancroft mark. Long before sunrise, the air around the valley began to shimmer. Every pine needle glistened as though covered in frost. Then the wind returned. Not a gust, but a breath. A single exhale that rippled across the trees. Out of that breath came voices. Hundreds. Men, women, children, layered together in one endless note. Not angry. Not mournful. Simply there. The sound bent the fog into spirals that glowed faint red, the same hue the sheriff had seen before he vanished. And in that light, the valley seemed to rebuild itself for just a heartbeat. A row of wooden houses shimmered into being. Lamps flickered in windows. The blacksmith's forge roared once more. And through it all walked Caleb Horn, lantern in hand, eyes hollow and calm. He passed down the ghostly street, every footstep echoing twice, once in this world, once in the other. Behind him, hundreds followed, each face familiar to someone who had gone missing in the Ozarks, When he reached the square, Caleb lifted his lantern high. The fog pulsed brighter, the voices rose until they became something more than sound, a vibration that shook the ground. Then, just as suddenly, silence. The lantern went dark. The town blinked out of existence once more. For years afterward, hikers and hunters found strange signs along the mountain trails. Circles of burnt earth, trees marked with runes, and old lanterns still warm though no flame burned inside. Locals called it the Night of 1,000 Voices. They said the forest keeps the memory of what it consumes. That if you stand in Dry Creek's valley on an autumn night and hum a single note, the woods will hum it back, perfectly in tune. And if you ever hear that harmony behind you, do not turn around, because the Vancroft blood remembers, and the forest always finishes its song. They say every cursed place leaves behind a whisper, a sound that doesn't belong to time, or to the living. Dry Creek was never rebuilt. No record, no census, no graves. Just a hollow in the earth that still sings when the fog rolls in. Maybe it's the wind. Maybe it's the memory of the people who vanished beneath those hills. Or maybe it's something older, something that learned to speak through the voices it took. If you ever find yourself in the Ozark woods and the night grows too quiet, listen closely. Because sometimes, silence is just the forest breathing in. And when it exhales, it might call your name. You've been listening to The Forgotten Remains. If you enjoyed tonight's descent into the unknown, don't wander off alone just yet. Because next time, we're traveling deeper, to a place where prayers are carved in bone and the dead never learn to stay buried.